Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club, the place where news happens. I'm Gil Klein, a former president of the club and the director of the University of Oklahoma's Washington Journalism Program and its Gaylord News Bureau. Thank you for joining us today for our virtual Headliners Book and Author Talk with Ron Brownstein, author of Rock Me on the Water, 1974, the year Los Angeles transformed movies, music, television, and politics. We'll get started in a moment, but just a reminder that we are happy to accept your questions and will ask as many as time permits. To submit a question, please email headliners, one word, at press.org. All the stars were aligned in Los Angeles in the early 1970s when music, television, and movies, all operating on a tremendous level of creativity, transformed American culture and politics in ways that are still relevant today. Joni Mitchell, Jackson Browne, Norman Lear, Carol O'Connor, Jack Nicholson, Warren Beatty, and Jane Fonda are just some of the influencers in award-winning political journalist Ron Brownstein's new New York Times best-selling book, Rock Me on the Water. Ron is a two-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of presidential campaigns, is a senior editor at The Atlantic, and a senior political analyst for CNN. He also served as the national political correspondent and national affairs columnist for the Los Angeles Times and covered the White House and national politics for the National Journal. He is the author of 6 previous books, most recently, The Second Civil War, How Extreme Partisanship Has Paralyzed Washington and Polarized America. He is, of course, joining us from LA today. Ron, we are delighted to welcome you to the National Press Club.
Yeah, Gil, thanks for having me. I've enjoyed many events here over my journalism career, but always on the other side of the microphone. So this is a fun and new experience.
Well, that's great. We're certainly pleased that you could join us by Zoom. So let's start out with you telling me a little bit about the Ron Brownstein story. Where did you grow up? What were the influences on your life that led you to journalism? What did you do at the LA Times? And of course, where were you in 1974?
Oh, good questions. Well, I grew up in New York. I grew up in Queens. My dad was an electrician, was part of the IBEW, and their scholarship allowed me to go to college at SUNY, the State University of New York at Binghamton. I was always interested in writing. I'm not really sure where it came from, but like as early as like first and second grade, I was writing in those composition books, long stories, kind of Lord of the Rings-esque fantasy type stories. I remember reading that in middle school and just, like Wesley Clark said, in 1968 when it was re-released. I always wanted to be a writer, thought I was going to write fiction in high school. I took a journalism class. The journalism professor thought that I had something going, and he made me editor of the school newspaper at Benjamin Cardozo in Queens. And then, and I kind of at that point, the road, diverged from being the great American novelist to being Johnny Apple. And I went off to Binghamton, went to work for the newspaper right away. Became editor of the paper by my sophomore year. I'm proud to say the first sophomore editor ever. The paper was called The Pipe Dream. This was like in the late 1970s, and it was renamed The Pipe Dream in the late 1960s by the students who wanted to express their view that the American dream itself was a pipe dream. So I'll just throw that out there. Tony Kornheiser, by the way, was the sports editor of the paper a few years before me when it was still the Colonial News. Anyway, after college, I came out and came right to Washington. After college, I worked for a group called the Center for the Study of Responsive Law, which was associated with Ralph Nader. And I was, my job was, we were kind of at the tail end of the Nader's Raider era. And as a result, there were a whole bunch of projects that had been finished but never completed. And my job was both to finish some of them and also to hire and supervise other people to finish others. And one of the ones we finished was the classic study on the educational testing service, which I think was really the beginning of the reconsideration of the use of the SAT. And then I co-authored a book profiling the top 100 people in the Reagan administration, did some other work, and then moved back into more conventional journalism, joining National Journal in 1983, worked there covering the White House and national politics. I started covering politics in 1984 when the great Mike Wines left National Journal for the New York Times, where he is still happily producing today. Started covering politics, covered the Reagan White House, and then moved to California. You know, in my late 20s, I was ready to try something else. I came out to LA. I wrote a book called The Power and the Glitter, which was a history of the relationship between Hollywood and politics going back to the 1920s, and started writing more regularly for the LA Times, both for their opinion section and magazine. And when I finished the book, I started my career at the LA Times as a national correspondent covering national politics out of LA originally, and then moved back to DC, covered the Clinton administration, covered the Bush administration, covered the Obama administration. Starting in 1994, I started writing a weekly column in the LA Times, which ran ultimately for 23 years every week. I think I might have the record there for maybe Robert Donovan, who's over my shoulder somewhere with his Truman biography. But anyway, after about 17 years great years at the LA Times, kind of one buyout and one corporate takeover too many, and I found a great new home at the Atlantic, where I've been happily working for the last roughly 15 years. And the other piece of my career is that starting in 1998, I became a political analyst for CNN after working on the Sunday shows earlier than that, Meet the Press and Face the Nation, and then started a relationship with CNN. And I have been, except for one short period, CNN political analyst ever since. And started writing a column for them as well a few years ago. So that's where I've been. I've always had this interest in, one last thought, which probably is something else you're going to ask me. I've covered politics for 35 years, every presidential campaign since Reagan Mondale. But I've always covered it much more from the outside in than the inside out. I've never been the person to kind of go to understand who's up, who's down inside the campaign, how decisions are being made. That's never been my focus. My focus has always been about how the agenda and strategies of the party intersect with the changes in the country itself, culturally, economically, demographically. And that has always been kind of my little niche, maybe following in the trail that Tom Edsall blazed in the 1980s. I kind of think of him as kind of the progenitor of a lot of the stuff that I do. And thus, I have always been interested in trying to understand better the way that culture and politics intersect, phase, bounce off of each other. And that's really what led me to this book.
So tell me now, of course, you told me before that in 1974 you were in high school or something. So
I was in high school in New York. Although I will say I went to one concert that is described in this book, so I can mention that.
But so what influenced you to write this book, and did Norman Lear, the great television producer, have something to do with it?
He did. In 1974, I was in high school in New York, and I actually did go to see in September of '74 the reunion tour with Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, which is part of the book. That also had Joni Mitchell's and the Beach Boys. I think that it was the day that Ford pardoned Nixon. Made it a very memorable occasion. Well, so, I had written this book, as I mentioned, when I lived out in California the first time in the late 80s and early 90s. I wrote a book called The Power and the Glitter, which was a history of the relationship between Hollywood and politics, going all the way back to Louis Mayer and Herbert Hoover. It didn't start with JFK. I mean, there's a long history there. And anyone who writes anything about Hollywood very quickly learns that the early 1970s, roughly the period that begins with Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate in '67, picks up with Easy Rider in '69, but really accelerates through the early '70s, is considered one of the two golden ages in Hollywood history, along with the years around World War II. So I kind of had that in my mental back pocket when I moved out back to California in 2014. I knew that the early '70s were a great period in Hollywood history. When I got out here, I started listening more than I did when I was in high school in New York to the California sound that was really dominant on the radio in the early 1970s. Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, the Eagles, Jackson Browne, Joni Mitchell, Linda Ronstadt, some of them you mentioned. And as I started listening to that, I remember thinking, that's kind of interesting. I mean, this is going on at the same time as Five Easy Pieces and Carnal Knowledge and The Godfather and Godfather 2 and Chinatown and The Conversation and Little Big Man and all of these early 70s classic movies. But the final tumbler did click into place when I went to a political event out here for Elizabeth Warren at Norman Lear's house, and Warren was kind of doing early moving around the country, thinking about running for president, obviously. And I do remember leaving that event and as I was driving home, thinking, okay, now wait a minute. Norman Lear was doing All in the Family and Maude and Good Times and the Jeffersons at the same time as Jackson Browne and the same time as Chinatown. And that was when all the tumblers kind of clicked and I began to seriously explore this period. And my interest kind of went through two stages. I mean, the first one was just recognizing, wow, this is an incredible confluence of talent. But as I got deeper into the research, it also became clear that there was a deeper current and something that was also culturally and politically significant.
So why did you pick Jackson Browne's song for the book title?
Yeah, Rock Me on the Water. So a really good question. And the song actually followed what I just said, my progression on kind of understanding the book. What initially drew me to this story was the idea that all of this was happening at once, at the same time, in the same place. I believe that if you look across the board, and this is going to sound heretical to people used to kind of, dissing LA, but if you look across the board at the talent that was operating at that time, at the same time, in the same place, I think it stands up next to any of the other periods that we think of as a golden era for a city in kind of the cultural landscape, whether it's the modern art world, the theater world in New York in the early 1950s, or even the literary world in Paris in the 1920s. I mean, we're talking about Norman Lear, James L. Brooks, Larry Gelbart, plus Carol O'Connor, Mary Tyler Moore, and Alan Alda in TV. We have, as you mentioned, simultaneously in 1970, the year that I picked, 1974, Jackson Browne, Linda Ronstadt, the Eagles, Joni Mitchell, all released career redefining albums. And then what's really striking and what makes this such a fertile period in Hollywood is that you have two distinct generations of directors simultaneously operating on all cylinders. You have the older generation of directors born in the 20s and 30s who were given more chance than ever before, for reasons we'll discuss, to execute their vision on screen. So that's Robert Altman, Bob Rafelson, Arthur Penn, Mike Nichols, Roman Polanski. And then at the same time, beginning really in 73 and 74, you have the first contributions from the great baby boom generation born in the 40s. Lucas, Spielberg, Scorsese, De Palma. So all of these people are operating at not to mention Beatty and Nicholson and Jane Fonda and Dustin Hoffman and so forth. So first thing that drew me to the story was that all of these people were operating in the same place at the same time. And I wanted to understand how that came to be. And that's what initially drew me to the song, because Rock Me on the Water, from Jackson Browne's first album, is a song that conveys the openness, the sunniness, the possibility of LA. I mean, it really does sound like, I'm going to get me to the sea somehow, or the Sisters of the Sun are going to rock me on the water. It sounds like you're driving down the Santa Monica freeway in a convertible with a surfboard, kind of sticking out of the back. That's what initially drew me to the song. And that's what initially drew me to the book. But as I started more deeply immersing myself in the pop culture of the period, I mean, what became clear is that this was the moment when so many of the ideas that emerged in the social movements of the 60s were cemented irrevocably into popular culture. Ideas like greater suspicion of authority in business and government, more autonomy for women, more inclusion of marginalized groups, a lot of ideas that have been considered environmental consciousness, a lot of ideas that have been considered insurrectionary in the 60s, began their journey to the mass American audience through the bridge created by popular culture. And Rock Me on the Water is the first of 3 songs that Browne writes on each of his first 3 albums that directly grapples with what I believe is the core question of pop culture in the early 1970s, which is what of the ideals of the 60s could be sustained in what you remember and I remember was a very different political environment in the 70s. When he sings on Rock Me on the Water, "Oh, people, look among you, it's there your hope must lie," he is reflecting that stubborn, persistent belief into the early 1970s that fundamental change, the kind of fundamental change that the social moves of the 60s dreamed of, is still possible. And really what I'm telling the story of is what of that impulse survived and how pop culture reflected the new compromises, what did survive, what didn't survive.
Now, as we talked earlier, and I pointed out you had a great, like 2 or 3 sentences that I thought summed up a lot about the book, and I was wondering if you could read them for me.
You bet. Yep. Working just blocks from one another, living in Brentwood and Beverly Hills, or amid the flickering lights of the Hollywood Hills, a cluster of transformative talents produced a sustained burst of pop culture mastery and innovation. Quote, there was a tremendous feeling of anything is possible, musician Graham Nash remembered. What do you want to think of? We can do anything. What do you want to play? What album do you want to make? There was no end to it. We were in this pool of like magic stuff, and it was rubbing off on everybody. Linda Ronstadt, a few years behind Nash in the climb to stardom, felt the same way. LA was a lens that American culture was focused through in those days, she recalled, like Berlin before World War II.
That's quite something. The magic stuff just jumped out at me.
Yes.
But can put this a little bit, we talked a little bit about it, into the historical context by, in the decade leading up to, from 1964, the United States had gone through a tumultuous decade.
Yep.
With civil rights, anti-war movement, feminist movement, political assassination, sexual revolution. How did all this play into the creation of what many that Graham Nash and many other called the magical stuff?
Yeah. So, if you look at movies and television in particular, music's a little different, and I'll come back to it. But the Hollywood studios and the television networks did their absolute best to ignore everything that you just mentioned. All of the turmoil that was remaking American society in the 1960s. As I wrote in the book, Walter Cronkite spent half an hour every night, documenting all of the new fissures, all of the new pressures, all of the changes, really convulsing American life in the decade of the 60s. And then CBS and the other networks spent the next 3.5 hours trying to erase it from people's minds. I mean, think about the hit shows of the 60s, the Beverly Hillbillies, Petticoat Junction, Green Acres, the Andy Griffith Show. Lucille Ball was still a big star. Ed Sullivan, Jack Benny had a show. Doris Day, Gunsmoke was still on the air. We didn't get any closer to Vietnam than McHale's Navy and Hogan's Heroes and Gomer Pyle, right? And the studios really were not much different. I mean, there were some great movies made in the 1960s, but they were historical epics like The Longest Day and The Great Escape, which was my favorite movie growing up, Steve McQueen on the motorcycle. Mary Poppins, The Sound of Music, until Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate. And even after that, there is almost nothing that connects to the times. Both the studios and the networks were operating essentially on the theory of what one programming analyst called the least objectionable program. The idea that because you needed audience, there are only 3 networks then, you needed audience that were really big in order for a show to survive. Everything had to be unobjectionable to as many people as possible, which in effect gave a veto to kind of the most culturally traditional rural parts of the country. Music was a little different. Music had to be more attuned to young people because young people were a bigger part of their overall audience than they were for the studios and the networks. So they began to change faster from kind of, rock and roll had come obviously in the 50s, but the idea of rock and roll saying something or the album as an artistic statement, that really doesn't come until the mid 60s, roughly around the same time as you see Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate. You start getting Pet Sounds and Sgt. Pepper and Blonde on Blonde. But so music begins changing 67, 68. The networks and the studios hang on longer, but ultimately their hand is forced by the same underlying demographic force, which is that the baby boom is becoming too big to ignore. I mean, the baby boom is, at that point, almost half of the country was under 25 in the late 60s. And it was simply too big a part of their audience to ignore. And that in a story that I tell, particularly in the TV side, the work of Norman Lear and this guy, Robert Wood, who most people have forgotten, was the president of CBS in the late 60s. They ultimately make the decision that, as one writer put it at the time, how many farmers you had watching didn't matter unless you were trying to sell tractors. And so they felt they had to create programming that was more relevant to the experiences and values of the generation that was becoming the dominant force in their audience. And that really was the impulse that tore down the wall between the medium and the moment, both for television and for movies.
So describe Los Angeles in 1974. You say it was poised between its parochial past and its cosmopolitan future. You quote someone as saying, LA before 1974 described it as a vapid desert of silicone and sunburn. That's not very complimentary.
No.
What happened?
Well, LA in the early 1970s was a very different place. I mean, if you go to the very beginning of the 70s, Sam Yorty is still mayor. Yorty, a kind of a maverick Midwestern populist who kind of ran for every office imaginable, but won re-election in 1969 with an openly racist campaign against Tom Bradley, who comes back and beats him in 1973 because Yorty had simply embarrassed the party, the civic leadership too much. And that really is a reflection of kind of where LA was in the early 1970s. It was not the big cosmopolitan metropolis that we think of today. The LA Times was just emerging from its kind of arch conservative past in the 50s under Kyle Palmer's influence and his closeness to Nixon. It was beginning under Otis Chandler to have global ambitions. Dorothy Chandler and the Music Center is happening. The ties between the West Side Jewish powers and the downtown business establishment are beginning to be forged. Angelica Houston was a really good guide for me to this period. I mean, she was an incredibly perceptive observer. She moved out here in 1973. She had been living in New York on the Lower East Side in the Andy Warhol circle of, urine scented alleys and late nights and drugs. And she moved out here and she said in 1973, she said it was like a garden. She went horseback riding in Griffith Park. She said you couldn't get fresh mozzarella in LA in 1973, 1974. It seemed like a very exotic idea. You could get a lot of cowboy boots and leather belts, and it still had that kind of Western feel. It was becoming something else. And the something else that it was becoming was reflected in this kind of conclusion among the corporate and business establishment that, Sam Yorty could no longer be the face of LA. Tom Bradley made sense as kind of the face of LA. And that captures the change that was going on. It was still a white man's world, in the entertainment industry. As I write about it at some length in the book, you begin to see in the early 1970s more representation of stories, of the stories, the experiences of Black people, to some extent Latino people, obviously women with the Mary Tyler Moore Show and Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore by Scorsese, A Woman Under the Influence. But the people controlling the telling of those stories are still overwhelmingly white men, much less higher up the food chain in terms of running any of these companies. So it was a city kind of poised in transition. There's still the club circuit for the music, a relatively small circle of places where people hung out. Irving Azoff gave me a great description of a typical night out in the early 1970s in LA. So it was smaller. It was not as global as it would become. But one other thing was different. Contrary to Annie Hall, it was not really looking to New York for validation in the early 1970s. I was growing up in New York in the early 1970s. That was the era of Ford to New York drop dead. I mean, New York was in a downward spiral, and LA did not feel as though it had to justify itself to New York. People in each of these industries, music, movies, and television, recognized that they were part of something special. They didn't so much recognize the breadth of it, that it was happening in these other areas as well. But in each of their own silos, they knew this was a period of change and innovation.
So one reviewer said that your book examines how politics and Hollywood ricochet off of each other. We were talking earlier about you had Nixon and the strange juxtaposition of the Nixon years and the LA culture. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the big lessons of the early 1970s is that, particularly at a moment of generational transition, culture changes faster than politics. Culture reflects the generational change more quickly. As you know, I cover politics. So, a lot of people who are watching know me, thinking about the demography of the electorate and kind of how those kind of cultural and demographic changes affect politics. The reality is that the electorate is older and whiter than the country, and always has been, probably always will be, because of who votes. And as a result, it's very possible, and I think often, that politics and culture don't move in tandem. They often can move in opposition. It is striking that these ideas from the 60s that I write about cemented themselves, triumphed in popular culture, precisely, as you note, as Nixon was twice winning national elections by mobilizing his silent majority of voters who were the most uneasy about the way the country was changing. And that reflects the reality that in a world where the electorate is almost always, I think probably always, I can take out the always older and whiter than the country, there may be times when you can mobilize a winning coalition by promising to stop the cultural change that is being reflected in pop culture. I think that was very clearly the case in the early 1970s. Nixon showed it, Reagan showed it in 80 and 84. So you can mobilize a coalition on the idea that you will stop the change. What you can't actually do is stop the change. I mean, that is the real point. And that I think the pop culture of the early 1970s was a better forecast of how Americans were going to be living 10, 15 years later than Nixon's victory in 1972. I mean, the fact is that after Nixon and Reagan, we did not go back to the Donna Reed show. I mean, relations between men and women did not go back to the 50s. The position of Black people and gay people and Latinos in society did not go back to where it was in the 1950s. Trust in government did not revert to where it was before the kinds of expressions seen in The Godfather or Chinatown and all of these other pop culture moments that solidified the message of Watergate and the Pentagon Papers and so forth. And I think we're kind of in the same position today. I mean, Trump showed that there is a substantial coalition you can mobilize on the promise to stop the cultural and above all demographic change that is remaking America. But I think if you watch the Grammys or you consume the pop culture that rivets these younger generations, you have a better idea of kind of the vision of inclusion that is going to prevail, I think, in 10 or 12 years. Doesn't mean the left is always going to win elections by any means, but I don't think in 10 years we're going to be fighting about transgender athletes any more than we are fighting now about gay marriage, which, as you remember, George Bush used and Karl Rove uses opposing that as a central pillar of their reelection campaign in 2004. The culture wars never end, but the baseline does move. It changes, and you start fighting again from that new point, and pop culture tells you, I think, earlier than politics, what that new Appomattox line is going to be.
So your book breaks down the year into 12 chapters coinciding with each month of the year.
Yeah.
Why did you choose that format? That's an interesting format.
So, any dynamic big enough to have lasting influence obviously doesn't happen in a single year. I mean, the changes that I am writing about in movies, music, television, and politics really, they begin in the late 60s, they gather momentum in the early 1970s, and in my view, they culminate or reach a crescendo in 1974. So I don't want to say that, all of this started on a dime on January 1st and ended on December 31st. Obviously that didn't. The Godfather happened and Five Easy Pieces and Carnal Knowledge, not to mention albums like Blue and Deja Vu, years before. All in the Family itself went on the air in 1971. But I thought that, so I considered the idea of just kind of telling the story chronologically over that whole period, maybe starting with Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate and kind of the Smothers Brothers and going through. But I thought that actually diffused the real tangible, sense of convergence. I mean, when you do this in 1 year, I felt it really underscored how much was happening at the same time in the same place. I mean, as you go from month to month, and you start in January, they're finishing the filming of Chinatown. In February, Jackson Browne and Linda Ronstadt are on tour together. In March is the conclusion of the 1 year where All in the Family, Mary Tyler Moore, and MASH, not to mention Bob Newhart and Carol Burnett, who are not slouches either, are on TV together. And then the Eagles have their breakout in April, the Patty Hearst shootout in May, and so forth. The simultaneous filming of Jaws and Nashville, which I view as an absolute hinge point in Hollywood history, happens in July. So I felt that by doing it within 1 year, you really give people a more visceral sense of how much of this was happening at the same time. I mean, it's really extraordinary when you think about it. I mean, that all of these things were occurring. And again, I felt that that conveyed better by concentrating the book into 1 year. Plus, I also think that 1974 was the fullest expression of all the trends that I'm talking about. And Gil, also importantly, the last year before the current starts to run in the other direction. In a lot of different ways, LA's cultural preeminence kind of peaks in 74, things start to change in 75. And I felt this was the moment, kind of the peak of the wave.
That we want to get back into that because that was so interesting to me. What also was interesting, we talked about the silos, that these people were all performing or creating within blocks of each other, but they didn't know each other.
Right. Yeah, so I had a very interesting experience in this, in that I talked to about 120 people. I mean, I talked to many of the people who are involved in creating this great work, whether it's Norman Lear and James L. Brooks on the TV side, Robert Towne, Beatty, Jane Fonda, Peter Bogdanovich, a whole bunch of people, and then Jackson Browne and Graham Nash and Linda Ronstadt, Irving Azoff. And what was clear was they recognized that something was happening in their industry. I mean, James L. Brooks, who is, pretty much of a, gold-plated genius, was talking about just feeling overwhelmed watching All in the Family on that CBS Saturday night when he was part of it with Mary Tyler Moore. And Jackson Browne talked at great length about this just roiling sense of creativity in the music industry and this sense that walls were breaking down. Several people, Jackson Browne, Graham Nash, Linda Ronstadt, talked about just how much people collaborated with each other. You would bring your guitar when you went to somebody's house on Saturday night, and people would say, "What are you working on?" And you'd play a few bars, and it would just be it was not only the musicians, it was the agents and the executives. I mean, there are a lot of times in 2019 and 2020 when I really wished I would be driving up to Malibu for, a Saturday night party at Linda Ronstadt's house in the Colony. I mean, it sounds really good. And then obviously in movies, I mean, Warren Beatty said to me some version of a paraphrase that, we were having fun because we were given freedoms that movie makers had never had before, right? I mean, in the early 1970s, the reins loosened for a lot of reasons. You could do movies about subjects that weren't acceptable before. Midnight Cowboy, about a male hustler in Manhattan. You could use language that you could never use before. There's a very famous line in Shampoo that Julie Christie delivers at a critical moment on election night, 1968, which I will not repeat for the tender ears of our audience, but it refers to her desire to do something to Warren Beatty's character. And when Robert Towne wrote the line in the script, even Beatty came back to him, he told me, and said, "Can we say that?" And the answer was yes. So there was a sense of excitement in each of these industries, but there really wasn't that much there wasn't really that much contact between them. I mean, the TV people had a very clear sense that the movie side looked down on them. Barry Diller, who became the head of Paramount from ABC in this year, said they were artistes, we were plumbers. That's how he and Michael Eisner, when they went to Paramount, were greeted as kind of these interlopers. Some of the movie stars, particularly Nicholson and Peter Fonda, were big fans of the music, but they were largely operating in their own silo. And, even the writing that's been done about this period. I mean, there are terrific books about each of these individual silos and about the movie industry in the early 70s, and Sally Bedell Smith's epic work about the TV industry in the 70s, and a lot of books about Laurel Canyon, which is actually a little earlier than my period. But I think what I was able to show here, and even I think I've gotten the reaction from some of the people who are in the book, was how this was all part of a common kind of thrust forward that was emerging out of the same demographic and kind of business imperatives. Joan Tewksbury, who wrote Nashville, wrote to me that what I really captured was the sense of a wave building. And I think that's what it was in LA in the early 1970s.
So let's break it down by the silos a little bit. You've talked a lot about it, but let's, what are the highlights starting with music?
Well, LA in the early 1970s unequivocally became kind of the center of the music world. I mean, in the early 60s, it was Greenwich Village and the folk movement. And then obviously in the middle to late 60s, it was London Calling with the Beatles and the Stones and Cream and the Who and everybody else. A brief window for the Summer of Love in San Francisco in 67. But by the late 60s and early 70s, whether on the corporate side or on the artist side, LA was emerging as a center of not only kind of hits, but also musical innovation. Because what was happening was that there were a bunch of artists, including Linda Ronstadt, including the Eagles, including Jackson Browne, Joni Mitchell, slightly different, who were looking for new ways to combine country, folk, rock, even R&B. And I tell the story, in 1974, the year that I write about, I focus on Joni Mitchell released Court and Spark, the album that made her a superstar. The Eagles released On the Border, the issue that left no question they were going to be a major force. Jackson Browne released Late for the Sky, which was his youthful masterpiece, maybe his masterpiece of all. And perhaps the most interesting story was Linda Ronstadt releasing Heart Like a Wheel in November 1970. All of these within a few months of each other, right? And all of them, by the way, under David Geffen at Asylum Records. And what makes Ronstadt, I think, so interesting is that she did not write her own songs. So she had to find material from elsewhere, but she had this vision, this sound in her head, this idea of a more what she described to me as a more contemporary sound on top with kind of a rootsy bass. And she, in a way that I don't think is really fully understood, she spent years spinning her wheels and struggling. I mean, she was beautiful, she was insecure, and as a result, she had a lot of trouble convincing the men, and it was always men, who were her manager, her producer, the record companies, to achieve the sound that she heard in her head. And I tell that story at some length because it is really emblematic of the struggles that a lot of women had in the entertainment industries in those years. And that's why Heart Like a Wheel, when she teams up with the great Peter Asher, who you can still hear on the Beatles channel doing his show as the former head of Apple Records and the brother of Paul McCartney's girlfriend in the 60s. But when she teamed up with Peter Asher, who had produced and managed James Taylor, she found someone who would listen to her. And the result is this masterpiece album, probably her greatest album, Heart Like a Wheel, that is kind of a triumph for the entire LA ecosystem of musicians, all of whom play on it, including Glenn Frey and Don Henley, who were brought together along with the other two original members of the Eagles as her backup band on her 1971 tour, as I talk about in the book.
So let's then we can go from music to television. Of course, we start with Norman Lear, and we go all the way back to the Smothers Brothers. Didn't they kind of start break the mold?
Right. In many ways, the television story most precisely encapsulates the overall transformation that I'm writing about. As we said, the 1960s, Newton Minow famously called television the vast wasteland. I said it could have been called the vast cornfield. because James Aubrey, who was the dynamic but very dysfunctional head of CBS in the 60s, had this vision like, here come the Clampetts and Gomer Pyle. There was a guy named Robert Wood who graduated from USC in 1949, who was not a revolutionary in any sense. He was an ad guy. He was a sales guy. He was a Nixon fan. He was a Reagan fan. He hated the student demonstrators at Berkeley in the 60s. But as he ascended up the ladder, first at KNX Radio, KNXT TV out here in LA, he created the big news. Jerry Dunphy, who was the model for Ted Baxter later on the Mary Tyler Moore show. Mary Tyler Moore's aunt was Robert Wood's secretary. So Wood ascends up the ladder at CBS. He eventually becomes president of the network on Valentine's Day, 1969. And one of the first things he does is cancel the Smothers Brothers, because the Smothers Brothers had been the first attempt at CBS to tap into the emerging youth culture. And they did. I mean, they, look at the bands, Simon and Garfunkel and Buffalo Springfield, people who wouldn't be caught dead, on TV, was for Squares. So the Beatles released the video of Hey Jude in America on the Smothers Brothers. But there were too many problems with the censors. The Smothers, they felt enormous pressure from their peers to use their platform to tell the stories of some of the protests and social movements that were emerging in the 1960s. And Robert Wood cancels them almost immediately after he becomes president in 1969. Yet Wood, even though he did that, because he came out of LA, was very receptive to the pressure that was emerging, not so much from the programming staff, but from the business staff. The business staff was telling him they had to get younger, they had to get more urban. As I said before, who cares how many farmers are watching CBS unless you're trying to sell tractors, right? That was a line from the LA Times TV critic in the early 1970s. So Robert Wood becomes the president of CBS, and he is receptive to this argument of the business community. He is looking for a show that, as he says, will start some conversation. Enter, stage left, Norman Lear, right? Now, Norman Lear is roughly the same age as Robert Wood. Norman Lear got to LA in 1949, the same year that Wood graduated from USC. Their careers kind of advanced mostly in tandem. And I think because Norman Lear becomes such a transformative figure, it is hard to recognize that before all of this happened, you would not have picked Norman Lear as the person to revolutionize television. There was nothing in his career up to that point that would have said to you, this is the guy who is going to make television fundamentally different than it had been before. I mean, he worked for the Martha Raye Show. He worked for Lewis and Martin. He teamed up with Bud Yorkin, the great director, in 1957, and they started their tandem productions. But what they produced was very mainstream. I mean, the Andy Williams Show, right? I mean, which was far from subversive. Kind of primetime specials with well-known stars. Their movies were Come Blow Your Horn. Norman Lear wrote The Night They Raided Minsky's, Divorce American Style, which has some little flickers of suggesting he had a desire to comment on the society, but not really. So Lear is kind of, as someone said to me at that point, Lear and Yorkin are yeoman producers. I mean, they're just pulling the oar and doing the work. But when he finds this British sitcom, Till Death Do Us Part, about a bigoted father-in-law and the liberal son, a bomb goes off within him, because it resonates, because it reminds him of his conflicts with his own father, Herman, who was kind of a small-time schemer, ultimately spent time in jail. And Till Death Do Us Part comes to him through a variety of sources, including Yorkin. And Lear, in his mid-40s, finds a voice that he had never found before. I mean, and writes this incredibly arresting, immediate story of Archie, Edith, Mike, and Gloria. And then what happens? He takes it to ABC, and they say no. Takes it to ABC again, and they say no. In part because they had tried a kind of sex spoof developed by the man who created Laugh-In, and it had been so offensive that the affiliates rebelled, and they felt they couldn't take it to anyone else. So All in the Family looks dead Norman Lear goes off to produce another movie, Cold Turkey, with Dick Van Dyke about, I think, a town where everybody tries to stop smoking. But the pilot gets to CBS. And Michael Dann, who was the head of programming, and Fred Silverman, who goes on to be, the most significant figure in later 70s television, his deputy, they see it, they bring it to Robert Wood, and Robert Wood, even though William Paley doesn't like it, thinks it's too crude, Robert Wood thinks this is the chance to test our theory. He puts it on the air in a story that I recount at some length, endless struggles back and forth between Lear and Wood, but it goes on the air and breaks down the wall, as I say, between the medium and the moment. Mary Tyler Moore had gone on a little bit before, but it was evolutionary, not revolutionary. MASH follows, Maude follows, Chico and the Man follows. It is the beginning. I believe it is the, January 1971, 12th, I believe, the day that All in the Family goes on the air, is the first step on the road toward the peak TV we live in. Because it was the moment that established unequivocally and irreversibly that the medium was a fit platform from which to comment on the society around it. And it does that. Even 50 years later, Gil, I don't know the last time you've seen that first season of All in the Family. It comes at you like a rock through the screen. Archie's language and Mike's retorts are just incredibly visceral. And that really, I think, that story of how these two unlikely revolutionaries transform television in many ways captures the larger transformation that I write about in the book.
And of course, then the movies. What was special about the movies? So much we've already talked about, but go through a couple.
I'll do the movies. I'll do the movies more quickly. The movies were operating under the same pressures as the networks, which was, they were having to respond to this growing youth audience. Unlike the networks, however, who made a lot of money in the 60s by giving out Beverly Hillbillies and Green Acres, the studios were ravaged. They were the shift, the decline in attendance really left them struggling. And so in the late 60s and early 70s, the basic trade they offered filmmakers was less money for more control, right? Lower budgets, but more authority. And this was most directly expressed in what the company called BBS, which produced Easy Rider, 5 Easy Pieces, The Last Picture Show, and so forth. But it was basically the transaction all throughout Hollywood. And so in this kind of window, an entire new generation emerged. And not only did a new generation emerge, but an older generation that had felt frustrated and stymied by the very gray Tuesday afternoon tendencies of Hollywood in the 60s, found an opening. Robert Altman had been kicking around for a long time, producing, his movie career seemed over. He was combat on TV, but then MASH in 1970. And after MASH, this whole series of movies that deconstruct Hollywood myths. And Polanski with Chinatown, Robert Towne with Chinatown and Writing Shampoo, back to back, Beatty with Shampoo and The Parallax View. And so there was this opening because the studios felt this enormous financial pressure, this need to try something else. You got a willingness to take a flyer on movies that probably would not have gotten, through the door a few years earlier. And then this window closes. Not, it is unfair to blame it solely on Jaws, but it is not entirely unfair either. And as I talk about in the book, Nashville by Altman and Jaws by Spielberg are filmed at the same time. They're released 1 week apart. In June 1975, Nashville's on the cover of Newsweek, Jaws is on the cover of Time, and they are the hinge, I think, because Nashville is not the best movie of the early 1970s. The Godfathers 1 and 2 and Chinatown at least are better, but it is kind of the Moby Dick of early 70s cinema, where it tries to encompass all of the major themes that were prevalent in the movies of the time and wrestle it to some kind of conclusion. Whereas Jaws is clearly the beginning of something else. The beginning of a blockbuster era that is about returning to kind of the 40s style, traditional Hollywood virtues. heroes to hiss at, heroes to cheer, villains to hiss at, excitement, adventure, done at an incredible level of skill, but without the commitment to social commentary of that older generation.
So tell me a little bit more about the scene going on in LA at the time, the clubs and all. Wasn't this the time of Whiskey a Go-Go and these, was there an explosion of this, or were these already there?
Yeah, it was still relatively small, right? I mean, there were the harder rock clubs. The center of the scene into the early 70s was unquestionably the Troubadour, which was just east of Beverly Hills on Santa Monica. And, the Troubadour was where Elton John broke in America. And it was the place. It was the kind of the platform. Monday night was their open mic night, and people would play and hope that, David Geffen or the next David Geffen or Irving Azoff would see them and, kind of light their life on fire. And Jackson Browne had a great description from me of kind of, on the one hand, it was supportive, and on the other hand, it was a sinkhole. It was a black hole. You could spend all of your time drinking whiskey and tequila in the Troubadour bar, kind of lamenting what you weren't doing rather than actually doing it. But it was mostly a supportive scene. The guy who ran it was a very eccentric guy named Doug Wesson, who his view was that he ultimately got gypped because he made people a star and then they went off to play the Forum or Madison Square Garden. So he made them sign these contracts where they would agree to do repeat engagements at very low rates like their first time. And that just, rankled not so much the artists, it rankled the artists somewhat, but it rankled the other big powers in LA, Lou Adler and Geffen especially, and all of the other producers and managers. And so they kind of, many of them, Geffen and Adler at the core of it, came together to create the Roxy, which is still there on Sunset Boulevard as an alternative. And that kind of becomes the central venue. And on the opening night of the Roxy, David Geffen meets Cher and begins what I describe as a truly improbable a romance. Geffen, who lived about as openly as a gay man could in those years, had his first serious romantic relationship with a woman by starting with Cher, which, as I write in the book, is like taking an interest in baseball by pinch hitting for the Red Sox at Fenway Park. So there was a club scene. There was a private club attached to the Roxy called On the Rocks, which was probably the one place where the movie elite and the rock elite could mingle. That was started by Lou Adler, who was a songwriter and then the producer. He produced Tapestry, among other things. But mostly, it was a small circuit, right? It was a relatively small circuit of restaurants. It was a relatively small circuit of clubs. And as I said before, there was kind of separation between where movie, music, and TV people hung out. By the way, the TV people at that point were producing 22 episodes a year. They were not hanging out anywhere. I mean, they were often working, virtually all night. I mean, it was, as Larry Gelbart said in one interview before he died, I mean, it was like assembly line work. I mean, it was a pretty demanding pace to produce 22 All in the Families or MASHs.
We're coming up close to them, but I have this important question I want to ask you. You had all these terrific interviews. Dish a little bit here. Who was really great to talk to? Who was difficult? I don't know whether we can get into that, but you got this collection of interviews. That's terrific.
As I learned from my Power and the Glitter book, it takes a long time to interview celebrities. It doesn't happen overnight. You really need to be vouched for by probably multiple people somewhere along the way. And it really is a process of using whatever connection you can to get to the first person, and then using that, basically getting validated by that in order to kind of help you, kind of move along the line. The first major, I think, celebrity who talked to me was Graham Nash, who was great. Talked to him in New York. I had interviewed Beatty for my previous book, The Power and the Glitter. And those of you who are old enough to remember Mario Cuomo will appreciate this reference. Interviewing Beatty is a lot like interviewing Mario Cuomo. Bill Schneider, the great CNN political analyst of the 80s and 90s, once wrote, that he was interviewing Mario Cuomo in a small single-engine plane, and halfway through he was wondering if he could open the door and jump out, because Cuomo basically argued with the premise of every question in a way that you spent time debating any word that you used rather than answering. Warren's a little like that. Warren's brilliant, but very argumentative. And so I spent 6 hours with Warren Beatty in his house, and then multiple subsequent interviews on the phone. Jane Fonda was great. But I would say that the two interviews that I found the single most perceptive were Angelica Houston and Linda Ronstadt. And it reflected, afterwards, as I talked to, as I said, 120 people, my kind of summary conclusion about it was that when you interview men about history, about their history, they are brave Ulysses. They are out there on the high seas, going through Scylla and Charybdis, conquering the Cyclops. I mean, they tell you the stories of their triumphs and failures. And many of them are perceptive enough to kind of, especially with this removed, to talk about their failures. But it's like their story. It's like, it's their odyssey. Women, not to put too broad a brush on it, but women were more likely to be anthropologists or sociologists and kind of think about and talk about how the whole community interacted. You don't get as much of that from the men. You get their story. But Linda Ronstadt was brilliant in kind of thinking about the relationships between the different pieces of the music world. Angelica Houston, similarly on the film world. The closest I got to that from a guy was Jackson Browne, maybe not shockingly, given kind of what he writes about and his songs. But that was an interesting distinction as I went through the book.
It's interesting. Let's see. We have so. Let's go back to politics and entertainment, especially in California. Governor Brown got into entertainment in a big way, didn't he?
Yes.
In his marriage.
Well, so Brown gets elected in 1974. He wins the Democratic primary the same month that Chinatown is released. When Chinatown was released, one reviewer called it Watergate with real water, right? and Jerry Brown wins the primary that month, essentially on the same theme. He wins the primary on a theme of generational change and political reform. And as I write in the book, Brown, in many ways, is, I think, along with Gary Hart that same year, the first mainstream politician who's essentially grappling with the same question that I said was the centerpiece, was the central thread through all the pop culture of the early 70s, which was what of the ideals of the 60s could be made relevant, and in his case, sellable to a political audience in the 70s. And you begin to see that in his campaigns. I mean, more focus on environmentalism, more focus on including women and people of color in appointments, age of limits, all of these ideas. And Brown begins to bring these in. His great interaction with the entertainment industry comes a few years later when he runs for president, and many of the Southern California artists turn up at his concert, including one named Linda Ronstadt, and they begin a more serious relationship. Very quickly, I will add, as I learned from the book from her, they had actually dated once before. In 1971-72, when he was Secretary of State running for governor, they had dinner. And she told him that, and he kind of explained that he was planning on running for governor, and she told him that he should, in his platform, include running on making prostitution legal.
There you go.
And they did not date again for 4 more years after that. So among the many stories, untold stories in Rocking on the Water.
So we're about out of time. Now, before I ask the final question, let me take a moment to thank the organizers of today's event. Headliners, co-team leaders Donna Linwan and Lori Russo, today's headliner event coordinator Linda Roth, club communications director Lindsay Underwood, and club executive director Bill McCarran. I would also like to tell you about some upcoming NPC headliners. Thursday, June 3rd, Jake Tapper, CNN anchor and chief Washington correspondent, will discuss his book, The Devil May Dance, a novel, at a National Press Club, a virtual book event at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, please join us for the last question. I was interested that a couple of things. By the end of the year, you said the scene had drifted from political activism to personal pleasure. And you also said that it was amazing that this force of creativity not only peaked in 1974, but you described it as vanishing overnight. So are these two things related?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Gil, thank you for doing this. I also want to thank my great friend Linda Roth, the great Linda Roth, for helping to make this possible. And I look forward to Jake, whose book I very much enjoyed about LA in the early '60s. Look, I think what happened after 1974 is that internal and external forces kind of dimmed this ascendance in LA. Obviously, it didn't end overnight any more than it started overnight. But after '74, there's a clear change, and you see a couple forces from the outside, the beginning of the first kind of stirrings of what will become the religious right, a backlash against the increased freedom of expression, but even larger than that, kind of an exhaustion with the audience about relitigating the fights of the '60s. I mean, literally, All in the Family is the generation gap reduced to a single. You are trapped in a single living room fighting out the '60s. Those are the external forces. The internal forces were drugs and kind of a sense of unlimited license that eventually produces Roman Polanski's arrest a few years later, for having sex with a 13-year-old. But cocaine in particular really started to have a debilitating impact on LA after about 74, 75. So it doesn't end overnight. You still get One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. You still get Network, the Hotel California, The Pretender a few years later. But the tide begins to shift. And really a perfect symbol of this is not only kind of the arrival of Jaws, but maybe the best symbol of all is Happy Days, replacing All in the Family as the #1 show on TV in 1976. The ultimate expression, we don't want to be fighting about the '60s anymore. We're going to go live with a family in the 1950s. And I think that really, along with Hotel California, which they recognized as their masterpiece, the Eagles, was kind of the obituary. We haven't had that spirit here since 1969, they sing in the song. And you begin to see something else happen. LA has had many creative periods since. It will again, but this particular moment when all of these industries were firing on all of these cylinders, and when the ideas that emerged in the social movements of the '60s were cemented into popular culture, that moment really, I think, begins to dissipate after 1974.
Thank you so much, Ron Brownstein, the writer of Rock Me on the Water, 1974, the year Los Angeles transformed movies, music, television, and politics. This has been such a great conversation, and hope you will be back again. Come back to Washington. All is forgiven. We'll let you come to the club again.
Thank you. Hope to do it.